Religious horror. This subgenre of horror has been scaring audiences for as long as there have been stories told. If we focus on Christian religious horror, then we can locate its roots at least as far back as the demon and witch-obsessed Middle Ages. And audiences continue to be lured into theaters, to click on streaming series, and to crack open books that present them with religious horror themes, demonic possession, exorcism, ritualistic sacrifice, and others. In today's episode, we take our first stab at religious horror. The two movies we will consider are A24's Saint Maud from 2019 and Neon's Immaculate from 2024. Both films present female protagonists navigating the world according to their religious beliefs, if from very different ends of the spectrum. Maud, a recent convert to Catholicism, works as a home health aide or nurse in Scarborough, England, after experiencing a hospice-related trauma. Cecilia is an American novitiate come to Italy to take her vows and to officially become a nun.
Both films locate the site of horror in the female body. Maud both denies physical pleasure and is swept away by an almost sexual religious ecstasy, as if one of the medieval or early modern mystics. Cecilia, on the other hand, immaculately conceives a child, or so it seems, and thereby embodies the Church's hope for a resurgence of political and religious power. The horror we as the audience experience works very differently in these films. In the former, our horror is clearly third person. In the latter, our horror is Cecilia's horror. How then does horror evoke joy in and on the destruction of the female body? What hope is there in the starkly different endings of each film? What happens when religious horror plays out as material horror, and instead of the fear of the ghost, the demon, or the wrathful god, we are left with the horror of the institution? Stay tuned as we explore the twisted hymns of religious horror, and try not to stray off key.
This is Horror Joy, a podcast about the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. We're your hosts. I'm Jeff Stoyanoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona.
I'm Brian Onishi, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona.
On this episode of Horror Joy, we'll be talking about religious horror with Saint Maud and then Immaculate. But I think we're going to start by just talking about horror and how horror is good for thinking. So, Brian, why is horror good for thinking?
I think this is one of the biggest parts of what the joy of horror is. Horror allows us to kind of think through what we think of as normal at any given time. And it then allows us to see a disruption of that normalcy, right? So we say, oh, what's normal? What is normal is actually kind of horrific. And so we now then get an idea of how to navigate the world differently. What new ways can we kind of think through how we act, how we understand the world, etc. And so this is a kind of intellectual joy of horror. And I don't think it happens every time. And maybe we can talk about directors or authors that create work that's kind of contrary to this claim. But I do think that horror allows for these important kind of public conversations. What about you, Jeff? You have some insight into medieval scholarship. How does horror interact with that medieval scholarship?
So with what we're talking about in today's episode, in particular with religious horror, had me thinking a lot about the work of Carolyn Dinshaw, in particular her book Getting Medieval. She posits that the Middle Ages remains this popular place because it's removed from us in space and time. And then as a result, we're able to imagine all sorts of things happening in the Middle Ages that probably didn't happen. But for writers of horror, audiences of horror, we see the Middle Ages sort of pop up so frequently, or at least this sort of faux Middle Ages recreated in the crumbling abbey somewhere in Europe. But the way in which horror works, irrespective of time, is this idea of disruption of normalcy. And then what happens with that disruption? How do folks respond to it? How do they deal with it? In the same way, though, the Middle Ages is very much the consummate other, and horror, too, is that consummate other, where we always are projecting our fears and the issues that we have, perhaps as a society, as we saw in our previous episode with Jaws, onto that other, and then blame the other rather than look at ourselves and say, okay, maybe we are the ones that are in some way faulty. In our last episode in Jaws in particular, we talked about communities, the in community versus the out community.
I like what you're saying here. I think that's one thing that's really important that popped out to me is that in terms of normalcy, how people respond to the kind of disruption of normalcy is really important. And how we understand the consummate other, where that locates us in our understanding of who is in and who is out, just like you were saying in terms of our conversation about Jaws and those communities there. I've seen arguments where horror is thought of as a kind of genre of resistance. It kind of helps us to have interesting conversations about disability and race and gender, kind of via this monstrous other. So again, seeing the other as a disruption of normalcy, and that brings us back to what we think now. I was reading this article called A Demon Girl's Guide to Life by S. Trimble, and they talk about how horror can teach us how to remake ourselves. And they call it this kind of kaleidoscopic view for people who are cast as real life monsters, right? So back to this kind of conversation about disability, race, gender, who is the monstrous other is important. And I like this connection with medieval ideology and the Gothic, because in my understanding of the Gothic, there's this view of the kind of crumbling infrastructure that's happening right now. It's showcasing the thing that's falling down. And in many ways, it provides a pathway forward to what is coming in the place of whatever fell down before. There are kind of worries about people, especially women who are reading Gothic fiction, that they were seeing the structures of the past. And I think that really works with religious horror. And so kind of moving from the Gothic, I think we can jump into some aspects of religious horror. We won't be able to talk about all aspects of religious horror. Like you said, this is our first kind of foray into it. There's lots and lots to say about religious horror specifically that we won't get to. So to narrow the discussion, right, we're taking up St. Maud and Immaculate. They're two fairly recent movies that really encapsulate this kind of religious horror subgenre that I think is really important. But what do you think, Jeff? Why do you think that religious horror is important right now?
Yeah, I want to speak to what you were mentioning with the Gothic, about how the Gothic sort of works with the idea of the crumbling past and how what comes next. And I think, interestingly, in 2024, we are in what some folks would call a post-capital society in which we see these sort of industrial ruins around us. So the Gothic resonates very well with our own contemporary moment. To that end, we're seeing the rise of Christian nationalism, and it is interesting how many of these things keep coming back to the medieval, because Christian nationalism, whether it's in this country or in France, I'm thinking of Marie Le Pen, all sort of project backward onto this medieval space as a time of, frankly, purity. Like, this is why it's dangerous, not just Christian nationalism, but white nationalism. And this idea where this was a pure time, we can go back to that time and not have to deal with all of these people who aren't like us. We talked before the show about really 3 women's bodies are sites of anxiety in these films. In St. Maud, you have Amanda, who is the woman Maud is caring for, and then Maud herself. And then in Immaculate, you have Cecilia's body. And as we mentioned in the open, the different perspectives we get, sort of the third person in Maud versus this very first person perspective in Cecilia, it's terrifying. We are having these conversations post, I think, 2016 in particular. We are concerned about moving backwards. We see things like The Handmaid's Tale that have become really popular in our culture, again, with a TV series and such. So all of these issues work really well in horror. So Brian, how do you see this working?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important. The religious horror kind of taps into these anxieties that are ongoing right now. And the callback that you mentioned to a previous time of purity, I think makes a lot of sense. While this isn't medieval times, right? We did have recently in Arizona a revival of an 1864 abortion law. And so again, right, this callback to a previous pure time, I think is important. And it's important as an anxiety that our culture and society is dealing with right now. I also think that religious horror taps into an existing mythology. And there's a sense in which if we already have a grasp of this mythology, let's take Christian religious horror in particular, we can embody or live inside the mythology, and it therefore just grabs those already existing worries that we have about maybe going to hell or demons or whatever it might be, but it's already in the background. It already works. These films don't have to do a lot of work to build the mythology and the ideology, it's already there. And I think that's really important about religious horror. And there's a way in which we can kind of see if you are a believer in these things, if you were a Catholic, watching The Exorcism was really scary. It was scarier than if you were not a believer in that ideology. So many of the horror movies that I don't like kind of fail to articulate a mythology. They're really built around the jump scare, and then they throw in a mythology kind of as a secondary issue. So the religious horror kind of building on an already existing thing makes it easier, I think, to jump into. And it allows us to see ourselves in the story. And I think this is important too. And when we jump into the actual films, I think there's a way in which the audience can read themselves into religious horror. We can see the horrifying nature of reality, or we can see what's going on in society is wrong, right? And that's terrifying. Or we can see the way that belief motivates specific action that seem a little bit closer to madness, and that's scary. Or whatever it might be, we can kind of see ourselves into those narratives. So let's jump into the movies. I think it's time that we kind of talk specifically about Saint Maud and Immaculate. So Jeff, do you want to start us off with our discussion of the movies in particular?
Yeah, let's start with St. Maud. So we get this weird flash at the beginning where there was some traumatic incident in the hospital or hospice she had worked at, and then we go into the movie and we see that she's in this transient phase, moving into her new position. She's caring for this woman named Amanda
Cole.
who has stage 3 or stage 4 spinal cancer.
I dare say you'll be seeing this one soon.
So the beginning of the movie, we see this weird relationship that develops between her and Amanda, where Amanda kind of goads her and makes it seem as if she is trying to believe what Maud believes, but really it's mockery the entire time.
My little savior.
Maud is trying to save Amanda through care. And eventually there's an incident at a party where Maud doesn't take well to the goading.
So what is it? Am I indecent?
No, you're lost.
And then she sort of is fired. And this is when we see her begin to self-destruct. She does this mortification of the flesh, again, a very medieval thing, although still practiced in some weird Opus Dei cult sections of Catholicism in 2024. She begins to have these full-body hallucinations. At least, I think we as an audience are supposed to think that. We get these sort of moments where she seems to be having these ecstatic visions or like something comes over her. But the way in which it contorts her body is horrific. Like her head snaps back and it's almost like her jaw's going to unhinge like she's a snake or something. As you just said, Brian, though, like it's difficult because if you are a believer in these sorts of ecstatic visions, then we don't know what to make of it. Like, is she actually having these visions? And this is, again, why we talked about the medieval earlier and the mystics and religious writing in the Middle Ages, because there are so many firsthand accounts we have of women in particular having these visions in which sort of Christ just comes to them and speaks to them in dreams or in bodily sensations. And I mean, in the title of the movie, like Saint Maud, like it's clearly playing into that, where she's being framed in this way for us to consume, literally, her as this religious experience. So that all happens at the very end. Then she has completely disconnected and is down along the shoreline in Scarborough. She thinks that she is going to take on her full angelic being at this point. She douses herself in some sort of ethanol, it seems, catches herself on fire. And then she goes up in flames, and in her mind, she's becoming an angel. But you get that brief glimpse of like how it's literally her body is just like completely engulfed in flames and she's in agony. And that's how it ends. Immaculate, Brian, maybe I'll turn to you to give like sort of a rundown of Immaculate, if that's all right.
Sure. Immaculate, we have Cecilia. She's an American born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. She moves to Italy and is taken into a convent. But once she's in the convent, there's this kind of strange feeling that something weird is happening. And I think in Immaculate, we get a hesitation and a skepticism about the institution at the very beginning. And we can talk about that. But as we go along, we find out that Cecilia is pregnant. And they go through this ritual of asking her about her vows. And she says over and over again, I have not had sex. They grill her
One last time.
in terms of her abstinence because they need to know that she is pure.
Have you ever had sexual intercourse.
Like you were talking about earlier, throwback to that medieval conversation. But once they establish that she has had no quote unquote congress with a man, then they can showcase this as an immaculate conception. And she's treated very differently in the convent. She doesn't have to work anymore. She's the Blessed Mother. Somebody asks her, when are they going to start calling you Mary? And she becomes this symbol of the female body on display. They kind of trounce her around as something to be worshipped. There's choirs singing. But again, we start to become very uneasy about the institution. We find out that, in fact, this was artificially inseminated from some DNA found on a relic, the nail of the cross of Jesus Christ, allegedly, right? That's the story that we're given. And it's really about her escape from the convent and what she does, what she finds out, how she gets out. And at the end, we have this really horrific scene. I think both films end with just a kind of terrible, horrific event. And I think we can talk about the ending a little bit as we go. But something that I think is really important for us is that in both films, we have the sense in which the body is on display. The body is important. In Immaculate, Cecilia is clearly a spectacle, whereas in Saint Maud, Maud is not so much a spectacle, although I think what you're saying earlier, Amanda is a spectacle in some way, but it is a denial of the body. It's in some way a celebration of the female body in Immaculate and a kind of hiding away or a denial of the body in Saint Maud. So we can kind of start there. What's that connection for you, Jeff? The treatment of the body in both of these films. What do you think about how they're different, how they're the same?
Yeah, I want to play on something you mentioned when you were giving us the rundown of Immaculate there, where they start calling her Mary at some point. And what's interesting to me as someone who was raised Catholic is Mary's always revered in the sense of like she is just sort of above the fray. She is the Virgin Mother, the Blessed Mother, all sorts of ways in which about thinking of her in both this sort of model of purity, but also this model of motherhood. In my home area of expertise, medieval drama, we see so many plays in which we see Mary put on display. And watching this movie reminded me of that, where we see what would it be like from the perspective of Mary to suddenly be told that your body's not your own, that something that you did not willingly participate in and have no recollection of is now going to be the defining feature of your life. And so Cecilia, we get a better sense of the horror in her face. Sydney Sweeney has these huge expressive eyes, and it's perfect for this role because you can see the fear in the scene that, Brian, you were talking about, where she is dressed literally as the Virgin Mary and all the nuns are singing around her. She just has like tears streaming down her face, and it's both at once beautiful and horrific. There's such a mixture of emotions there at that point. But this idea of the female body is spectacle. I mentioned the pregnancy, the Immaculate Conception. In the movie, it's almost framed as possession, where suddenly there is this being inside of her that she has no idea how it got there. She has no control over it. And then as a result, she has no control over her body because the institution, as you talked about, the church, now has control of her. And we can read this as an allegory in a lot of ways, whether it's for just the church as, capital C, Catholic Church, or whether it's for whatever institution happens to be the one regulating a woman's body, such as the US government or whatever else. In Maud, possession works a little differently, though. Like we talked about how it's a bit of an ecstasy. We see how that is then juxtaposed against addiction and drug use in the film with Amanda, perhaps, and some of the parties they're throwing. It's very clear Maud's also poor. I'm not really sure what to do with that yet either. Like there's a poverty here that maybe is playing into the religious theme, but that's also a way in which she's sort of juxtaposed against Amanda and all the people she's caring for too.
I think that's important. The reason why I wanted to jump in here is because in both films, we get this sense in which the women think that they have been saved for some greater purpose. And there's something interesting about that. So Maud here, she says, I know that you saved me for some other thing.
I can't shake the feeling that you must have saved me for something greater than this.
And that gives her a kind of mission to care for Amanda, but to care for her in a specific way. And for Cecilia, this sets her up as you can see the scene where the priest comes to her and says, has got to be kind of a big commitment. And she says, you know what? I knew that God saved me for something else.
I know God saved me for a reason, but I guess I'm still searching for what that reason is.
And this, I think, gives the priest the kind of go ahead in his mind to say, yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take her body, and we're going to use her body to bring about the birth of our Savior.
A simple procedure could bring us salvation.
Or whatever it is. And so I wonder if there's a sense in which this desire to think of themselves as saved for some greater purpose allows for the kind of possession discussion we're talking about.
I think that's right. And I think it also plays into the way in which the possession, whether it's pregnancy or the spiritual possession, tie into the denial of the body, which we see that's a trope throughout sort of Christian mythology. It's actually a trope throughout human existence, human history. We've talked about St. Teresa of Avila, who is one of the mystics, who sort of is 16th century Spanish mystic, who goes into these ecstasies, has these visions, and then there's part of the denial of the body that works there. This is just a typical trope in Catholicism, particularly medieval Catholicism, again, where the idea is that any sort of bodily suffering you have on earth merits the greater reward in heaven. And that still might be preached at some pulpits, I'm not quite sure. But Brian, this plays into your area of expertise, philosophy as well, with some of our more famous philosophers, Augustine for that time period, but then Plato even earlier.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's interesting connections with Plato. And to be very brief about this, Plato kind of says what we should be doing is we should be seeking out the good and forgetting the things that are temporary, and we should seek the eternal good. St. Augustine brings that in to the Christian church. And I think we still have that kind of idea, is that what we need to do is we need to deny the body.
Never waste your pain. Never waste your pain.
And we need to seek out the kind of the pure relationship with the spiritual world. And the way that this works out is very different in the two movies. For me, there's something about Immaculate that is a deconstruction story. So when we talk about the kind of the rise of white Christian nationalism, there has also been a wave of deconstruction by ex-evangelicals trying to figure out what they think and to move away from some of the trauma that they've dealt with, spiritual trauma before. And I see Cecilia as a kind of deconstruction story. So as she's asked to deny her body, to say what your body is just a mere vessel for carrying this child.
Cecilia, you've been searching for a reason. God saved you. This is it.
This is the beginning of her deconstruction story. She starts to reject the institution. She starts to reject the authority of the priests that are there. And again, when we tap into the anxiety of something like abortion laws in the United States, I think there's something here too, where this focus on reproductive rights has led a lot of people to start to question what they think, how politics and religion navigate together. And so here, the horror of Immaculate is bringing forth the horror of our given situation right now. In St. Maud, it's very different. She, in fact, goes deeper and deeper.
Never waste your pain.
And as she denies her body, this is her trying to rid herself of everything. There's that scene after she slaps Amanda and is fired. She goes out to the bar. She has multiple sexual encounters in a short amount of time, drinks a significant amount of alcohol, gets back to her apartment, and vomits everywhere. And this is where, if we were to talk about Julia Kristeva and her ideas of abjection, we kind of see this. What is the horror of the body? It's the stuff that's inside that should stay inside, but is now outside. And that's horrific. But at this moment, we see her lifted up, held in the middle of the air by what she thinks is, and we're supposed to kind of maybe think, is some kind of spiritual caregiver. And at that moment, she goes deeper and deeper into the denial of the body. She puts these spikes in her shoes and she walks around. And that leads us all the way down to the final scene where she says, I'm going to deny my body so much so that here we are. I'm going to set myself on fire, and this will show you. I think there's something really interesting there. I want to hear your thoughts about it. I will also want to ask you how this relates to belief generally. I think in many ways, in both films, we get this sense in which the belief of the person or the belief of the institution becomes horrifying for us. And so what do you think about the sense of the horror of belief itself?
Yeah, you need belief for the horror to work in these films, which you mentioned earlier, I think, where there's a pre-existing mythology in both of these films, if you will. I would add to that even if you're not a believer, the horror is that these people exist, right? Like that sort of, if you don't believe in any of these things, I think Immaculate still works as a horror movie. Saint Maud definitely still works as a horror movie because of what you see. But when we were talking about Kristeva there for a moment, that idea of objection, you see that in Saint Maud with like the dirtiness. She always looks a bit grungy. I mean, there's a bit of a filter on this film, right? Like, I mean, it could be that it's set in England and it's supposed to be cloudy and dark. It could just be the way it's usually shot. A lot of our shots are either indoors or at night. She's rarely outside during the day until the very end. So yeah, there's that element of sort of the dirtiness, the grunginess, where she is. She refers to Scarborough as, why would she want to be here? This place is awful. I don't want to be here. And I think, interestingly, we see her Dear God diaries sort of go away as the film goes on too, where she's talking to God like, Dear God, it's me.
God, all I feel of you now is this pain.
Well, you know that. And it's sort of this weird, almost childlike sort of discussion that she's having with God. With Immaculate, as you mentioned, sort of the horror and the objection of the body, where she loses control of the body and other people are ruling the body for her. I think it's interesting to think about that. For me, some of the greatest horror in that movie is the lab, where we see the failed experiments, like they keep in a jar. This priest who is also a scientist, and maybe that'll help sort of segue us into our next topic for discussion too. But this priest is scientist who has been trying to, as Brian said earlier, use the DNA from some holy relic to create, I guess, the second coming through this pregnancy. Relics are a huge deal. Still in 2024 in Catholicism, the idea of materiality that exists that helps us somehow connect to the spiritual. And this, I think, is a point of interpretation for both of these films. The idea where, how do we use the material in order to get to the spiritual? And again, for Maud, it's deny, deny, deny. In Immaculate, it's somehow we're bringing the spiritual into material existence through pregnancy, through the weird former nail in the cross. I think it's what it's supposed to be. It looks like a railroad tie, frankly. As someone that grew up in Central PA, I'm just like, that's a railroad tie. That's not at all historically accurate, but we'll go with it. That's fine.
Some people might see just an old piece of iron. For those of us who know, we see proof of Jesus' sacrifice.
But in both cases, we do have the way in which horror is projected on these bodies through abjection, which is to say, we are supposed to not pay attention to the health, to the physical circumstances of these bodies, because they are being used. And the passive construction there is very important, because they're not actively choosing anything. I guess Maud is, but in her mind, she's now a vessel. So like the actions that she's taking are actually what God is telling her to do. So we could maybe argue there's some psychological horror there. Is this a horror about mental health in its way? But for Cecilia and Immaculate, like, she is totally not in control of her body. Even so much so that, we didn't talk about it when she tries to escape, right? Like she is trying to get out of this convent the entire time. And she eventually does try to make her little escape, and they realize that she's pulled a ruse on them, and they take her back, and she's running, like probably 7-8 months pregnant at this point. Like she's pretty far along, trying to sprint through a field to save herself. So I wonder if this is a good moment, Brian, to sort of move into then this final part of our discussion. How do we see science versus faith working in these films?
Yeah, I think that's good. I think before we do that, I want to just highlight that scene where she runs away is one of the most striking scenes visually. So we have that one where she's become the mother. She's put on display the kind of saint circle is glowing in the back and there's a choir going. And then there's this one where she's running and her gown is bloodied and we get the countryside and it's striking. The thing about the science versus faith for me is that it also highlights a different distinction between supernatural horror and material horror. And so we talked about how religious horror taps into an already existing mythology. And I think that happens here. But in both of these movies, I think that the horror ends up being material horror rather than supernatural horror, right? It's not as if we think that there are actually demons. In fact, nothing like that really shows up in Immaculate. There's a scene in which she goes to confession.
Bless me, Father, for I have sinned.
And after a while, the priest starts to kind of fade in the distance and she's grabbed and there's this horrific scene. And we think that this is maybe a dream, but it reminded me of Rosemary's Baby, where in Rosemary's Baby, at least the novel, Rosemary is taken and she seems to have a dream, but it's really them like impregnating her. And this happens with Immaculate. And this is where she gets inseminated. Other than that, right, there's no supernatural element in Immaculate at all, which is interesting because it's in a convent in the deep countryside of Italy over the catacombs.
All of this, it was built on the catacomb of St. Stephen.
Catacombs?
It's off limits.
So there's all these places we could expect supernatural horror, but it doesn't happen. And St. Maud too, I think we're meant to believe that this is not actually happening to her. And that what she perceives as occurring, the swirling in her beer, and even her conversation with God at one point, God is supposed to have spoken back to her in Welsh, that it doesn't seem like that's actually happening. And I think the best evidence we have is at that very end when she sees herself as an angelic being and everybody's kneeling in front of her and she's converting everybody, she's actually like just on fire in agony. And I think this goes back to that sense in which, especially for Immaculate, what we end up with is a fear of the institution itself. The beginning scene, we see somebody buried alive. Already, I don't trust this institution. Why did the filmmakers do that? I'm supposed to distrust this institution.
Open your eyes.
I don't trust this place.
Along the way, we clearly see that they are treating anybody who goes against what they say in a horrific way. Gwen gets her tongue cut off. This is Cecilia's best friend. And for me, what they're trying to do is to use science as a mechanism for regaining power. So maybe the first foray into the science versus faith conversation we can have is, one, there's no supernatural horror here. It's all material horror. And two, that science is being used by the church, especially in Immaculate, to flip the power structure. They're trying to take back power by using artificial insemination and obviously Cecilia's body. So yeah, what's your take on the science versus faith conversation?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the moment where God apparently speaks to Maud in Welsh. That's kind of a signature move for A24. They love to bring back these Welsh isn't a dead language, but sort of languages that are either more and more marginalized or dead, and they use them as part of the horror. This idea of like, most of our audience will have no idea what these words mean, and so therefore it will seem that this is somehow horror or God or something. I mean, it's not quite Mel Gibson bringing back Aramaic for The Passion of the Christ, but it's close. I mean, there's something about language there maybe to be unpacked a bit. But I think it's as you say. There's definitely not spiritual horror in any way with Immaculate. I think you're right. Like, this is entirely material. It is written from, I would argue, almost an atheist perspective, looking at the church from this way of, we are going to unpack all of the smells and bells, as they would say, to understand what it is that's happening here. There's a scientific explanation for all of it. And in fact, it's driven by science with the hope that science can then be turned into spiritual belief. With Maud, I'm not so sure. On one hand, I want to agree that it's fully material, but even if it's not an actual experience with God, which I don't know that it is, I think it's at least psychological. She clearly believes that she's like having these conversations with God. No one around her believes this, for sure, but she clearly believes it. And so when we get those flashes of her perspective, like you mentioned at the very end, even before the scene on the beach, we have the one where she seems to think she has wings. This, I think, after her conversation with God. She has these like sort of glowy, ethereal, ephemeral wings like you'd see in some sort of steampunk fairy depiction. And then she goes down to Scarborough and sets herself on fire. People watch on in horror. That last scene's really interesting because these people all fall to their knees from her perspective. This is one of the first times in the movie where you get this shift from Maud's perspective to outsider perspective in rapid succession. So you have this scene where people are looking on in horror, as one would if someone was about to set themselves on fire. Then you have Maud's perspective, where she sees all of these people kneeling in reverence of her, that she is finally being recognized as the saint that she is. And then we sort of move out from the perspective of others entirely and just are focused on Maud, where you have her face looking in this sort of like beatific toward the heavens as if she is some sort of saint, like you'd see in a Renaissance painting, right? But then it flashes to like, looks like fire and brimstone hell, where like you can see her skin charring and smoldering and she's screaming. Like, and that's another sort of point of comparison between these two films. Just agonizing screaming that we have at the end from both of these female protagonists at what has happened through horror to their bodies. In Immaculate, Brian talked about it a bit. He mentioned it with the pregnancy where Cecilia gives birth to what she's been impregnated with, and she is screaming. I watched it in theaters the first time, and with the sound as loud as it is in these movie theaters, it was uncomfortable. It was discomforting. It's a type of horror that it's not like, oh, I'm scared. It's a type of horror where I have empathy for like the horror that what this person is going through. Even though like as a man, like childbirth is something that I will never go through. But like the clear physical pain she is in giving birth without any sort of medicine around her, even though this is how she got in this mess in the first place. There's some irony there to unpack perhaps. And then she gets this giant rock because she's going to kill the baby, although it's pretty clear from the sounds we hear that like it's not a viable child. It's probably monstrous given what we've seen from some of the science experiments that also went wrong in the church's basement.
Yeah, that scene is really interesting to me. And part of it is because when she's screaming, like you're saying, it's so loud and so incredibly bodily that she's screaming right into the camera. So she's screaming right at the audience. And again, if horror is good at uncovering and revealing our own anxieties and putting the kind of light onto how we can do things differently, I think in some way, the screaming into the camera could be an indictment of the audience so that I'm screaming at you, do something.
That's really interesting. And I think maybe this is a good moment then to consider, given the name of our podcast, given our sort of entire premise, what joy could we possibly get out of these two films, right? So you and I have talked a lot about this leading up to recording today, and it's clear that the joy is not any sort of satisfaction of just watching what's happening. The joy is in the conversations we can have coming out of these films. I think it's really important that horror films in 2024 are responding to political moments in the United States and around the world, because women's reproductive rights are in many ways at risk around the world. We see a sort of general re-entrenchment of conservatism and sort of right-wing evangelical ideology, not just in the United States, but around the globe. So to see a horror movie use these tropes that we've seen so many times before in this productive way, I think is very important, because hopefully many people are listening to this podcast and they are thinking about these conversations in the way we are. But even if they're not, seeing that film is going to, whether consciously or subconsciously, resonate with them about, oh, wow, what does it mean for a woman who is pregnant to have no autonomy over her body? What does it mean for a woman who may have a non-viable fetus within her to have to carry that to term? With Maud, it's not sort of reproductive rights as much as it's mental health. What does a society look like in which someone who is clearly struggling, rather than help them deal with whatever trauma it was that brought them to this point, they're fired from their job. She clearly needs help and no one is going to get her help. Rather than help engage her in conversation about these beliefs, about this sort of idea that God's actually talking to her. They mock her and castigate her, which in an interesting way is what she wants, because she kind of wants to be like Jesus in that way. So yeah, I mean, Brian, joy. Talk about joy. How can we end this on a positive note?
I agree with you. Taking joy in the actual images is really difficult. This is not, 1970s horror movie where the effects are really funny or, we can kind of laugh at this. This is a hard thing to watch. Both Maud and Cecilia go through something traumatic. I think the empathy that you talked about earlier is really important. Joy, for me, is something that can be also difficult. It's something joyous. It makes me stand outside myself. I think it's a positive emotion, but it also can be hard at times. And I think the empathy that we feel with Cecilia is strangely a little bit easier, perhaps, because we can empathize with the idea that she's being deceived, that she's being used, and she deconstructs. Like, we are with her in the kind of turning against the institution. And I think there's a sense of joy in that empathy and taking up her story. And even in the communal act of her screaming at us and saying, yes, this is horrific, and I'm so sorry. And not only that, but maybe I can do something, right? This turns my attention in a way that's important. It's harder to be empathetic to Maud. In some way, I think what Maud provides for us is this dual aspect of the danger of radical beliefs. She goes down a pathway that leads her to literally set herself on fire. And that is dangerous. While watching this, I thought, yeah, we've got to be really careful about these radical ideas and how belief can motivate actions. We can see this in maybe the January 6th insurrection. Maybe we can see this in the ways that laws are being made now. Maybe we can see this in white supremacy, that beliefs lead us down a path that is dangerous to ourselves and to others. On the other hand, we can read Maud as potentially mentally ill. It's difficult because we can have empathy at the same time that we can decry her belief. What does she do at the very end? She goes to Amanda's house. She wants to care for Amanda. Right before this, she finds another care worker and she says, I respect any medical professional so much. I think it's the most important thing you can do. Almost. And it's clear that what she thinks the other thing is saving somebody's soul.
To save my soul, if I understand correctly.
So she goes to Amanda's house. She cares for Amanda. She wants to save her soul. And in that final confrontation, Amanda rejects her. And what does she do? She sees the devil in her.
I hate to be the one to break it to you, but it's just you and me here.
And it's a confrontation with the devil. So again, what we have is this split where Maud is trying to care for Amanda, but her beliefs and maybe her mental illness have sent her down this pathway. And we can say, I'm so sorry, Maud. I'm so sorry. And so maybe it's hard to find joy in that empathy. But the two things you mentioned, we are talking through these films in a way that I think is important. It shines a light on these anxieties that we have in our culture right now. That's important, and there's joy in that for me. Thinking through our situation right now, what can we do? That's an intellectual joy, the emotional joy of empathy. And realizing that empathy and practicing empathy is hard, I think there's some joy in that as well. And so we take away these two things, the intellectual and emotional joys from these movies. They can be hard, but I think we can find the joy. Before we leave, I want to talk about a couple of things, if you're willing. One of them is the institutional aspect. Again, in Immaculate, there's this distrust of the institution almost immediately from the first scene. And we want her to deconstruct. We want her to leave the catacombs. We want her to escape this entrapment that she's in. In Maud, I think there's an interesting scene where Amanda gives her the William Blake book, calls her savior, and she says something that was interesting about William Blake is that he rejected organized religion.
Religious themes would play a prominent role throughout Blake's career, namely a rejection of organized religion which she claimed was an ugly distortion of a true spiritual life.
And it seems as though Maud is like, yeah, let's do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a relationship with God alone. It seems as though she's Catholic. I'm with you on that. Saint Maud, right? That makes sense. But there's also a sense in which I think Maud is rejecting the institution. And here, what we get is not the horror of the Catholic Church writ large, but the horror of this kind of maybe non-denominational evangelical Christianity, which has led to some really horrific political ideologies, at least here in the United States and beyond. I think that juxtaposition of the institution is interesting for me. You have thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Again, like medievalist alert. I need like a little sounder for that. One of the reasons for which the Catholic Church did not have biblical texts available in vernacular languages throughout the Middle Ages was this idea of control, right? So we can read control from a very patriarchal perspective, which is saying that the church fathers literally wanted to control those people beneath them by the ways in which they disseminated knowledge. They let them understand what the Bible meant through their interpretation, probably to sort of maintain power in many ways. However, a more generous reading of that level of control, of keeping sacred texts in their original language, or at least in a learned language like Latin, because the Bible wasn't written in Latin, by the way, just putting that out there, nor was it written in English. There was a recognition of the danger of having people who didn't really understand context having direct access to these texts, and what might happen as a result. So this really hits ahead going into the 15th century, end of the 14th century. The Lollards are reading the Bible in the vernacular, and this is really upsetting authorities. But I don't think it's coincidence in some ways that you then have this uptick in mysticism towards the end of this same period, where you have another practice that is common in late medieval Catholicism is affective piety, where you're meant to sort of picture yourself at the crucifixion. And then in doing so, like you are inserting yourself into quote unquote the performance of the crucifixion, whether from the perspective of Mary, some people even from the perspective of Christ, which is a little strange, or one of the apostles, whatever. But the idea that you were there and to sort of elicit an emotional response to then therefore probably bolster one's faith, unmediated, without an institution to sort of help explain what's happening. I think, yeah, you get exactly what we see in Saint Maud. If you remove yourself entirely from a belief system that has rails, if you will, guide rails, that sort of help guide you into understanding what it is you're seeing, what it is you're experiencing, it helps regulate that a bit. And regulation's often used sort of with a negative connotation. But with religion, I think regulation often is a necessary thing and has a positive connotation, because it's someone who actually has greater expertise, has more experience kind of helping you try to navigate these experiences. When Maud, as you said, when she gets the Blake book from Amanda, when she completely sort of removes herself from a belief system, that's really dangerous. And if each of us individually thinks that God is speaking directly to us, then we're not really in conversation anymore, in dialogue anymore. We're just talking at each other. And I mean, I think in many ways, that's kind of how we got to where we are, even sort of politically in this country, where you don't have really conversations anymore as much as you have people shouting at each other. And so I wonder, I mean, it's not a distinctly American thing, right? Obviously, Maud's set in the UK. But for us, for the two of us as Americans interrogating these films, I think that resonates like really, really loudly. It's different for Immaculate, right? Institution there is what's, as you said, perpetrating the ills upon her. And so it is curious that we have these two movies that have so much sort of overlap in their way, and yet institutions in one way are the thing that is perpetuating the horror. And then on the other hand, it's sort of the lack of institution that sort of allows the horror to run amok.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. There's a sense in which having an understanding of the limits of belief is important, because especially if we understand something as big as belief in God or religious beliefs, this can take on, like we see in St. Maud and in Immaculate, both, Very dangerous repercussions for people. One other thing I want to just point out here in terms of distrusting the institution is that the second time I watched Immaculate, I laughed out loud when they question her, they interrogate her, and she's like, I've been celibate the whole time, right? I've been celibate my whole life. And so they hand her the cup, and then immediately there's this scene in which they're wheeling in the ultrasound machine. And in my head, I laughed out loud thinking, oh, you're telling me this convent just happens to have this ultrasound machine. And there are other reasons why you would get ultrasounds for different medical treatment, et cetera. But there was just a sense in which they're dusting off this thing that they have in the corner. Oh, we just happen to have one. And then later on, you find out that the doctor that's been caring for Cecilia is also a licensed obstetrician who delivers babies a few times a week. That just happens to be his day job. And you're like, yeah, okay, really? We should have seen this coming, where something is going on. Cecilia is being set up. But again, this gives you the skepticism of the institution.
Yeah, exactly. There's a doctor who just happens to be on call for this convent with an ultrasound machine, who is also an obstetrician. So yeah, it is curious, right? How institutions can present themselves to make it seem like, yes, this is perfectly normal and you shouldn't question any of it.
Exactly. There's one scene that I think is really interesting. When Cecilia is taking her vows, there's these shots where we clearly see from Cecilia's perspective, she's looking up at the priests and they're looking down on her. These scenes set up this power relationship where Cecilia is clearly in a position of having no power. And at the very end, the main priest puts out his hand with a ring on it, and she just looks up and is like, what? And the other priest is like, yeah, go ahead. And she kisses the ring, right? There's this kind of weird sense of giving up her body in that moment of a demonstration of power imbalance. And I think that plays out throughout the film.
Yeah, it's forced subordination. I mean, that's essentially how hierarchies work all around, but specifically in the Catholic Church. And I think that's an interesting observation about that institution and how it keeps going.
All right, let's wrap up. So what we've done today is we've done a little bit of talking about horror and how horror works generally in terms of being good at helping us think through some ideas. We've also talked about the way that both Immaculate and Saint Maud showcase a kind of female body as spectacle and the body as something to be denied in religious horror. Finally, we talked a little bit about science versus religion, how that worked in each film, and some other kind of ideas along the way in both Immaculate and Saint Maud. Of course, this is our first foray into religious horror. We didn't touch on everything or even close to everything. There is a lot more to say about religious horror, and hopefully we have an opportunity to take up this once again. We talked a little bit also about the joys of horror. These are difficult films to watch, difficult images. How can we find joy? And we discussed those things as well. So, last thoughts, Jeff?
There's a lot more to say about religious horror. That's the thought I'll end with. We're going to have a lot more in Blake, I guess, too.
I love that idea, and I look forward to those conversations. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.